a lot of things have happened across the board, and just collectively, I know that within the US, but also here in Canada and elsewhere, where we are deeply entangled with US imperialism, US politics, we are mourning with you for the things that were lost in the election. And also, I guess just want to speak into being, we are with you in the sense that we want to dream collective futures together in capacious ways. So that's sort of the first thing I'm holding space for. And then the second is that not far from where I live, there is a small lake called Enos Lake, which is at one time until very recently home to one of the newest uh, evolving pairs of sticklebacks on the planet. They were called the Enos Lake stickleback pair, species pair, a benthic and a limnetic species pair that had adapted from being marine species to lake species probably about 12,000 years ago and had been evolving to separate from one another and specialize in the lake. And about 40 years ago in the 1980s, development was slated to open around this lake. And mysteriously, at the same time, someone introduced something called the signal crayfish into that water body. And it has completely decimated that species pair. And on Monday, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSOIC, formally declared, it was published by the federal government, that that species pair is now extinct. And so I live just down the road from the catastrophic destruction of what was one of the most, newest diverging species on the planet. And the entanglement of that extinction is hard not to equate with some of the human interventions that may or may not have been deliberate, so that developers wouldn't have to deal with the hassle of 90-meter setbacks and Species at Risk Act um, kind of requirements and critical habitat orders that would have been in place had that species continued to exist. And so I know that maybe a presidential election and the loss of a pair of sticklebacks may seem divergent, but in my mind, they're kind of attributable to some of the things I'm going to be talking about, which is the hegemony of white capitalist imaginaries and colonialism. But before we start, maybe I guess what I like to do, especially when we're coming into there's a lot of emotion that we're carrying because there's so much going on in our lives outside of the talk. As I pull up my slides, I just invite you to take a moment to think about a particular body of water or a particular aquatic species or a particular place that is really meaningful to you, that brings you comfort or joy or meaning. And just like hold that with you if you can through the talk, just maybe as a way to kind of ground us. Because I know that for me, like I got 2 hours of sleep last night from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. and then woke up and just could not go back to sleep. And so I'm hoping that collectively, I hope what I have to say is relevant or interesting, but even if it isn't, at least we can collectively think about those places that mean so much to us, that are still worth fighting for, that are not lost causes. Even with the collapse of the Enos Lake stickleback species pair, there is now a hybrid pair, well, a hybrid fish living in the lake that is still worth caring for, which is still worth protecting, even though the federal government now no longer sees it as a special interest. It is still a species that exists on the planet that deserves attention, and not to be obliterated to water a golf course and build 1,700 luxury homes, as my local government is aiming to do in the next few years. So I'm just gonna share my slides, and I'm a little rusty with WebEx. I've only used it once before, so this is all just on the fly. So I'm going to open up my slides and get going. So please, can someone just tell me verbally, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Here we go. We're off to the races. So I wanted to talk today about quantum entanglements and critical Indigenous fish philosophy, looking back on 50 years of critical Indigenous scholarship on science, philosophy, and fish in Canada and the USA. And this is part of a really deliberate turn in my work towards away from kind of reconciliation or liberal conceptualizations of braiding, bridging, and weaving knowledges across Indigenous and settler paradigms to actually fully embracing an anti-imperialist science, fish science in the prairies where I grew up. And I'll explain as I go why I felt the need to really move towards that. And so part of it is Indigenous sovereignty. And of course, we could talk at length about the complexity of even calling Indigenous autonomy sovereignty. I like to think that Indigenous worlds and cosmologies actually refract Western concepts. And so when I'm saying I'm craving Indigenous sovereignty, which I drew before I learned about the signal crayfish that was part of the collapse of the local Enos Lake stickleback, uh, I drew this for a friend who loves crayfish, a Haudenosaunee friend who loves crayfish. Um, but yeah, this is part of my move, my deliberate move in my work away from my liberal past. I was the kind of person who wanted to be the mayor of the city of Edmonton. I worked for the former leader of the Alberta New Democrat Party. Like, I fervently believed in the system up until really a decade ago. And so I'm someone who really thought we could work within the system. And it's been in the last decade that I've really had to face the fact that I don't personally believe that's possible, and that we need the resurgent capacities and the solidarities of diverse, non-Western, and Indigenous ways of doing things in the world to disrupt the hegemony and the violence of white supremacy. And so I do that work through fish because that just happens to be who has caught my attention. Um, so just to sort of situate myself, because I do think it's very important in this age of white people pretending to be Indigenous, that I need to be very intentional in situating who I am, how I come to being a citizen of the Manitoba Métis Federation, which is the government of the Red River Métis Nation, and is historically tied to Louis Riel and Gabrielle Dumont and various leaders from our community, our nation, our society, who stood up in two armed resistances against the state in 1869 and 1885, and fought for our right to exist as a nation, not as a people subjugated to Canada's laws and whims. So on my dad's side, I descend from the Todd, Dufresne, Cardinal, Desjardins families. That photo on the upper left is my great-great-grandfather, William Todd III. The person in the middle is my grandfather, George Todd, who I unfortunately never got to meet because he died fairly early in 1972. And then on the bottom are my great grandparents, James Todd and Caroline Laframboise. All three of them have, shaped me in various ways through the stories that my father, Gary Todd, who's a Métis artist, who's pictured here, who honed in me and inspired in me a deep love for the lands and waters of Alberta, which is a place that is under constant extractive violence in order to fuel oil and gas industries. Canada is a significant supplier of oil and gas to the US, and Alberta supplies the bulk of that. So these territories, these lands and waters pictured here on the left is my father and I, sort of in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Stoney Nakoda Nations territory, where my grandfather actually worked on resource extraction projects, because this is some of the work that Métis men found themselves doing in the 20th century. So my dad took a lot of care when I was growing up to take me into the places that his father worked, but also where he spent time as a young person learning about, the lands and waters in Alberta. And then the picture on the right is in a boat that my dad built that we actually have in our backyard still, a dinghy, on Baptiste Lake, which is a lake named for Baptiste Majot, who was a Métis man who lived in central Alberta in the late 1800s. And it's a lake where my settler family, my mom's side of the family, had a small cabin. And this is where I was introduced to fish and all the critters that animate work and still drive my passion for protecting fish and water. And then the other person I just want to really center is my late stepfather, Wayne Roberts, who passed away in 2018 and who was an ardent and passionate advocate for species at risk in Alberta. He also was Red River Métis. He's descended from the Mackay, the Sanderson, the Anderson, and the Cook families. And he was a Métis scientist. And this will come back in my talk because I argue that we need to go beyond kind of the braiding sweetgrass version of liberal Indigenous knowledge that has become so popular across the US, Canada, and Europe, to actually recognizing that we have always been scientists. And the reason that we're really good at being scientists and close observation of phenomena around us is precisely because diverse and dynamic non-Western and Indigenous practices and cosmologies lend themselves to, careful observation and engagement with the world. And so Wayne was one of the people that signaled the collapse of bull trout in Alberta as a very young man. He started on his own as a teenager documenting their disappearance in the waters that he grew up on in central Alberta, the Red Deer River watershed, and into the eastern slopes, that area that I showed in the previous slide, where my dad and I spent time when I was little, and now where I work with members of the Stoney Nakoda Nations to acknowledge and communicate to settler publics about Stoney Nakoda laws and protocols about how to respect and protect bull trout and other Indigenous trout species in their home waters. Some of the really poignant things about Wayne, not only was that he was at the foreground and the forefront of signaling the collapse of certain species in Alberta before other scientists caught up. He actually dropped out of his PhD. He found sort of the way that Western science was being practiced in the academy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to be kind of holding him back. And so I think of him as a renegade scientist too, because he was doing things that threatened the establishment as well. And one of my favorite anecdotes of his work, in sort of going through the archive of the newspaper articles about him that document his work advocating for these different species, was that the way that he was able to notice, before others noticed, the northern leopard frog was collapsing on the plains in Alberta, was he noticed that, in his words, a note was missing from the spring symphony in the evening on the plains. And I think about that a lot, that he was so attuned and engaged with his environment, and this was an environment that he had connections to, through generations of his family as well. And my great regret is that he passed away before he could see bull trout formally protected by federal legislation in 2019, a year after he died. He brought his concerns about bull trout up to the Alberta Wilderness Association in 1982, the year before I was born. And it took 36 or 37 years of bureaucratic efforts to get that species finally recognized as a threatened species. And in that time, they have lost a significant amount of their range, significant amount of their population numbers. And this is also what fuels my realization that bureaucratic Western scientific approaches just are not capable in their current forms of actually doing the work that we need them to do to protect fish. Of course, there are some success stories, and these are always important to celebrate, but on the plains and the prairies where we're dealing with oil and gas and mining, the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan River and other important tributaries that water the prairies across Canada are at existential threat levels due to not only climate change and agriculture and forestry and other industries, but also mining and the very, very real threat of Gina Reinhart, Australian coal baron, her efforts to undermine federal and provincial laws to open up a metallurgical coal mining enterprise in some of the most sensitive waters in Alberta. So these are the people that inspire me to fight back against that liberal, democratic, sort of bureaucratic, settler, colonial framing of how to be in the world that is failing us and failing the fish and failing the water at least in Alberta. Maybe there are places where it is working, but as an Albertan and as someone who's now living in British Columbia, which is also a resource economy, the way things are currently operating is just not working. And so this is why I've been driven deeper and deeper into quantum mechanics. And I also just have to shout out my mom, who comes from a settler, a British and Norwegian settler family that made their way to Canada in the late 1800s, and also on her father's side right after World War I. My great grandfather on my mom's side was a carriage builder. They were working class Brits who came and through the machinations of settler colonialism, were able to get land, build a business, and my grandfather became a very successful businessman. And just by the machinations of being a white settler, really, he was able to operate in ways that my Indigenous family never could dream of, accumulating that kind of wealth or property. So it's maybe a little controversial to talk about this, but we're like trying to create space for this in Canada right now, because the feds have actually codified braiding, bridging, and weaving into federal environmental policy. And while on the face of that, that seems like an incredibly progressive movement. If you've been watching the news, I'm not sure if the film Yinta is on Netflix in the US, but yet on the one hand, we have Environment and Climate Change Canada sort of espousing this idea that it respects Indigenous knowledges or epistemes, which of course we have to be careful about how those are separated from ontologies and being. And on the face of it, this seems so wonderful and progressive, but when you see how they operate on the ground, and you see Environment and Climate Change Canada and Department of Justice and other bodies saying like, we uphold these Indigenous knowledges, but at the same time they're mobilizing paramilitary force and the police to brutalize Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis land defenders across different parts of Canada, we see that kind of collapse of the claim to goodness when it is enacted upon the bodies of Indigenous people, but also upon the bodies of water and the lands that we all rely on for existence, in the name of, again, oil and gas, mining, and these other global corporate forces that are very intent on eviscerating any last kind of vestige of Indigenous autonomy or sovereignty here in the country. So there's a brilliant scholar who I want everyone to know their name. They are a Nehio philosopher who finished their master's at the University of Alberta this spring with Jessica Kolepanak and Kim Talbert. Kira Long is doing amazing work. I think she's doing her PhD in the US right now. And she talks about how, these efforts to kind of braid, bridge, and weave need to be questioned because they're actually still grounded in possessive ecologies. And she draws that from Go and Paul scholar Aileen Morton Robinson's work on white possessive ontologies, the patriarchal white possessive logics that drive settler colonialism and the continued violation of peoples around the planet in the name of white supremacy and colonial capitalism. So I've been asking for a number of years now, what could a non-possessive engagement between Indigenous and settler expressions of existence look like in fish work in the places I work, which is the Lake Winnipeg and Saskatchewan Nelson River watersheds, which are also the watersheds I am tied to through generations of my Métis and earlier Cree family and ancestors. So like I said a little while ago, we have always been scientists, and I really believe in this. And I believe in refracting the concept of science. I have a Bachelor of Science, a Master's of Science, and I did my PhD in social anthropology in the UK. And in my view, I've come to and I was raised by Wayne, who himself, studied zoology. And I've come to kind of my conclusion, and I'm open to, challenge, but Western science to me is a misnomer in that it should not be the universal, and lots of people have argued this, so I'm not saying anything new here. But to me, the way I understand science, at least as it's practiced in fish conservation in Canada, is really that it's a bureaucratic way of collecting all the knowledges stolen and appropriated by Euro-colonial capitalist entities over generations from peoples all over the world, from Africa, from the sort of like Islamic golden age of math and science, from East Asia, from all over the world. And these things have been kind of cobbled together in what I think of as like the British museum version of science that often is held as the the epitome of science right now. But really, it has been weaponized. These beautiful observations and experiments that have been done by people all over the planet to explain the world around them, from Ibn al-Haytham and his thinking on optics and light, to, just different like mathematical equations and like brilliant ways of analyzing the world that have come from people all over the planet. This has been weaponized in this kind of science that I want to disrupt. And I look to people like Kim Tallbear and Jessica Kolepanek and others who are doing Indigenous STS work to really move away from, normalizing that version of science and re-engaging a resurgent Indigenous politics and governance into that. So I've come to the conclusion in my own work that rather than braid knowledges, which get divorced from our laws and our protocols and our sovereignties and our title and our rights, rather than braiding those knowledges to the very systems that dispossess and displace our ontologies and existences, what can it look like to stop reflecting back to a settler audience what they already think exists in the world, and instead thinking about refracting and diffracting? And so when I say refract, it's that phenomenon that Ibn al-Haytham described in the medieval era of, the way light bends when it goes through different densities of media. And then diffraction is where we're going to get into the quantum mechanics. And I apologize, like I'm on 2 hours of sleep. I imagine you're probably quite tired, so I might not dive as deeply into the quantum mechanics, just as an act of mercy, maybe, because I'm also not a physicist. And so when I explain these things, it's in a definitely more philosophical angle. But I've come to a realization that the flatness of how Western entities still view Indigenous knowledges as something they can consume and possess. And they're just braiding it into the violences that continue to dispossess people around the planet. And that's not worthy of what these knowledges actually, like the knowledge that they are misinterpreting in a lot of cases and, appropriating into their existing systems. Like it's just such a violence to those knowledges to sort of say, like, we're going to braid, bridge, and weave with a federal government that uses secret forces to spy on First Nations land defenders in British Columbia. Like it doesn't pass the sniff test, is my conclusion. So why have I come to quantum mechanics? I think it's because I have become disillusioned with the flatness of a Western perspective on the world that still is driven by those Enlightenment era principles of binaries and dichotomies and that two-dimensional space that Descartes kind of popularized. If we can figure out where something is in two-dimensional space and graph it, that's good enough to kind of stand in for the whole. And I think actually no, we're at a point where we have to be able to delve into the complexity and the discomfort and the difficulty, but also ultimately the like wholeness of our entanglement. And that's what quantum mechanics offers to us if we're willing to engage in it in that philosophical sense, which a lot of physicists themselves have even said, it's like you're not going to get research money to think about the philosophy of quantum mechanics. As far as we're concerned, both Chanda Prescott-Weinstein has talked about this in her work, and Sean Carroll, who does a lot of popularized, that's my wake up alarm. Sean Carroll, who also has done a lot of really important popular science work on physics to help lay people like me come into their world, also admits we're not teaching our students the philosophy of quantum mechanics. This is just something we don't do. So that's exactly where I want to lean in. And I want to ask those questions about, if quantum mechanics is imploding that classical binarized flattened world that helped people come to a lot of important conclusions over the last few hundred years, but also, reached its natural limits at the end of the 1800s and into the 1920s. What are we being asked to step into? And Indigenous thinkers have a lot to say about that. And Indigenous thinkers have been writing about quantum mechanics for 50 years and thinking at this really high level about what quantum mechanics is demanding of us when it says there is no determinacy in the universe, that actually everything's entangled. Things are balances of probabilities, and there's a shifting there's just like shifting realities that unfold as we engage with the world around us. And so that is that move from knowledge, which is what the braiding knowledge kind of world is still dealing with, which is, I mean, I think it's a good entry point, and I'm not here to say that people shouldn't do it, but I think that it's still incomplete. And when we get to the quantum world, we're moving beyond knowing and epistemes to the ontology, the being, and the ethics that come with that being. And non-Western and Indigenous practices have always dealt with that deeper, denser kind of set of questions. And so there's a few key things I want to point out. One is that, drawing from Karen Barad, that there's an ontological inseparability of everything interacting in the universe. And so everything is interconnected, and not in a metaphorical sense, but like at the deepest levels of all the energies, matter, space, time, and causality in the universe. And then the other thing I want to draw attention to is like white possession and how it still operates in the world. And that's how you can have Environment and Climate Change Canada and other federal bodies saying we're braiding Indigenous knowledges into our work, but still have federal lawyers go to court and say we do not have a responsibility to provide clean drinking water to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across the country, and say it with a straight face, because they can still split themselves in that very binarized way and believe, on the one hand, we are doing good while doing incomprehensibly violent things to the people whose lands the state draws its existence from. And so it draws to mind the line that James Baldwin employed in one of his essays in The Nation in 1964, where he said, as that old line goes, I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And that's also why I've moved away from the braiding knowledge world, which is all about what people are saying they're doing. And I'm much more interested in what people are actually doing. And in the world of fish conservation in at least the prairies in Western Canada, the state is not doing what it says it's doing. It is still basically giving carte blanche to industry, to municipalities, to provinces to pollute, destroy, divert, impede waters and fish habitat. And then the tools that we have available to us through their legal systems to help protect those fish take 37 years to even come to the point of saying like, oh, there's a problem. And then they have to be threatened to be with court action by pro bono lawyers to actually then take the other steps in their legislation to create critical habitat orders. So you can tell I'm frustrated. And still, I know this is still probably to a lot of people, Canada still sounds like it's really progressive and we're on the right track. And yet, even in the so-called progressive space of Canada, we deal with these everyday violences. And it's because the core of Canada is built on what Aileen Morton Robinson calls the white possessive, which is, as she says in the words of her late uncle Dennis Benjamin Morton, the problem with white people is they think and behave like they own everything. This, of course, as my friend and colleague Devon Shaw pointed out to me, is really analogous to W.E.B. Du Bois's white dominion. And so Ella Myers is a scholar at the University of Utah who has sort of analyzed Du Bois's writings to sort of like articulate and think with his concept of white dominion. And so in the sort of like opening parts of The Souls of White Folk, he talks about how whiteness views itself as having ownership over the entire planet. And so this is just a quote I pulled that I think speaks to some of the things that we see when the mask slips in our environmental conservation advocacy work in Western Canada here. You have the person who says, I'm here to uphold the good, I'm here to reconcile, I'm here to be the good neighbor, the good ally. But there's also this other reality going on because Canada itself is built on anti-Blackness, on anti-Indigenous ontologies. And so Du Bois wrote, quote, I see the working of their entrails, I know their thoughts, and they know that I know. This knowledge makes them now embarrassed, now furious. They deny my right to live and be and call me misbirth. My word is to them mere bitterness and my soul pessimism. And yet as they preach and strut and shout and threaten, crouching as they clutch at rags and facts and fancies to hide their nakedness, they go twisting, flying by my tired eyes, and I see them ever, end quote. Of course, Du Bois is speaking as a Black man in the United States of America with its violent history of chattel enslavement. But this is analogous to some of the sort of continuing views of Black and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada, specifically views of racialized Indigenous peoples in Canada. Most recently in British Columbia, a riding south of where I live was decided by like dozens of votes. And the person who almost won that riding was a woman who is a doctor who was interviewed on election night here for a provincial election on October 19th and openly called First Nations savages, openly called them that. And the leader of the party didn't denounce her until it was clear that she had lost the election. And there were other instances of anti-Palestinian racism and just open disdain for people from marginalized and oppressed and displaced and dispossessed groups by various members of the party that almost won the election. And so in that sense, like British Columbia, which is often seen as this like progressive haven because we have Vancouver and, you know, we legalized pot here in Canada, and there's all these things that are markers of our progressiveness, but that white possession, that white dominion, the metaphysics of individualism, all still animate that space. So Karen Barad talks about how the metaphysics of individualism, this idea that the world is composed of individual entities with individually determined boundaries and properties, drives still a lot of Western understandings of existence. And so this is where I'm going to get into that. I said I was going to talk about 50 years of, you know, Indigenous science. And this is where I get into that because Vine Deloria, sorry, not Vinio Deloria, that was me typing this morning on 2 hours of sleep. But Vine Deloria, the late great Dakota philosopher and theological thinker and political activist who advocated for Native American sovereignty and tribal rights in the US and advocated for Afro-Indigenous communities as well in the US to be recognized. And just like a really foundational thinker to the discipline of Indigenous studies in the US and Canada, he was thinking about these really like esoteric but important questions about, you know, existence and science and physics and quantum mechanics 50 years ago almost. And so I was so excited to come back to this because I had started teaching my courses in the 2018, 2019, 2020 with Robin Wellkammer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And it was like a really good entry point for a lot of folks, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. But I was starting to realize like there was something that was falling flat. And I pushed myself to sort of figure out like what was going on that made this text feel too easy to consume in my classes. And that was when I started to realize like she doesn't cite people like Vine, people like Gerald Visner, who are writing really critical takes on Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then I realized I had an obligation to go back to those foundational thinkers in my discipline. And I actually got rid of Braiding Sweetgrass from my courses in 2021 and instead taught Wretched of the Earth and had my students think with Frantz Fanon and kind of like globalized the course. And then suddenly we were having completely different conversations. And I think that's also that shift away from the binary of settler Indigenous relations to actually the solidarities across displaced and dispossessed people that I also think moving beyond Newtonian physics and that sort of like classical physics that breaks the world into these manageable concepts. Actually, you know, if we move away from that and we implode it with Indigenous and non-Western practices, we come into a much richer way of understanding our obligations to one another. So Vine reminds us that Newtonian physics and all of the things that they established in the 1600s, they were just things that were concepts that were in Newton's mind that he used to help explain what he was observing. And of course, he was an incredibly careful and very important scientist. And we are indebted to the way that he explained the universe. We are indebted to the way he, co-invented calculus with Leibniz. But we've been caught up in this world that Newton and Descartes kind of invented to help explain the world in their way. And I feel like we're still trapped with the ghosts and the nightmares of the world that they fomented by deciding that the world was exactly as they measured it. When in fact, there's all these competing ways of explaining it because we are more than just Euro-Western imagination. So this is maybe I won't go into full detail of all the things I wanted to talk about because I don't want to get into the weeds too much. And I'm conscious that probably you just have like a lot on your mind and in your heart right now. But this is kind of maybe where I really want to focus my attention, is just this beautiful quote from Vine Deloria in his Metaphysics of Modern Existence in 1979. That was a turning point for me last year when I reread it, and finally this line leapt out at me and I went, it's been sitting here all along. And I didn't see it until I guess I was ready to see it. And it's this line where he says, quote, "Scientific inquiry has now," and he's talking about the how quantum mechanics, evolved and came into being in Western physics in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, when basically like the conundrum of light being both a particle and a wave really challenged the limits of the classical Newtonian physical way of explaining the world in terms of like time, space, matter, causality. This was all starting to break down because Maxwell discovered like the electromagnetic force, which is actually that electricity and magnetism like co-constitute each other. And so all these things were coming up that were challenging the limits of Western science. And we now know, of course, that like through people like Einstein and Bohr and Schrodinger and other important physicists at the time, they developed an entirely new way of explaining existence, which is that, and not all of them immediately agreed with it because it completely challenged their worldview. That the universe is actually maybe more contingent and entangled and much weirder than we thought and spooky. And so Vine is reflecting on this and saying, in the 1920s, scientific inquiry has now become part of a larger process of interaction that can only be described as incorporating relationships of personal quality with nature to produce knowledge. And this is the line that changed my life. Western science has thus arrived at precisely the starting point of non-Western peoples in apprehending more than physical and mechanical activities in nature, end quote. And so really, rather than braiding Indigenous knowledges into Western science, what Vine invited us to do almost 50 years ago was actually remind Western science that it has only reached the starting point of non-Western peoples. And in that, I include Buddhism and Eastern philosophies that have always understood things to be related through waves and interconnection or interbeing, and the concepts that have emerged out of Buddhism through people like Thich Nhat Hanh. And so this to me is very powerful because it also answered a question for me of why was I struggling so much sitting through these government and academic meetings where someone would usually a white academic would explain to Indigenous conservation officers and land managers and others working for different First Nations governments and Métis governments as well. There would often be some like well-meaning white academic who would make us sit through like a half-hour lecture where they would tell us what ethical space was and what ethical relations were. And it was still that folding of Indigenous peoples back into a Western paradigm. And people are so unfailingly polite in those contexts and just sort of like will give that academic their space. But to me, it's such a violence against the autonomy of our nations that actually we should be meeting as diplomatic partners working across our different worlds that our laws bring us into. And Western actors should be so lucky to have a conversation with us about what we know from hundreds, if not thousands of years of engagement with a specific pond or a specific turn in the river, that someone, who maybe has done even 30 field seasons can't approximate the knowledge that our nations hold. So then also this gets us into conversations by other really important Indigenous thinkers who've thought about quantum mechanics for a long time, like Umik, Dr. Richard Atleo, who was the first Nuu-chah-nulth person in the world to get a PhD. He is from the western side of Vancouver Island, and he has written two really beautiful books about the concept of oneness and how that animates Nuu-chah-nulth worldview. And he talks about the symmetry between physical and non-physical, which is, of course, stuff that quantum mechanics gets into, but completely stymies like a classical view of the universe. And so I've just pulled out these lines here that are really important, I think, is that since reality is a unity, what befalls one part of this unity must befall the whole. And this also evokes for me the understanding that none of us are free until all of us are free. So yeah, again, Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who is a really important Kainai Blackfoot philosopher, legal scholar, education scholar, political leader in Alberta, also has like spent decades thinking about Indigenous metaphysics and how they engage with quantum mechanics and how quantum mechanics could learn from Indigenous metaphysics. And he draws attention to how linearity, singularity, particle view of the world is what characterizes, in his view, Western thinking, and that this is at odds with what he points out, which is that non-Indigenous practices are wave based and don't need to be that sort of like individualist, white possessive particle view of existence, but actually that waves can unfold as disturbances through space, time, and matter, and that isn't disrupting like an Indigenous perspective for most nations across so-called Canada today. So that wave particle duality that Einstein was so foundational in describing and showed that light could be a wave and a particle, and this has gone on to be described for other particles as well. It was that first kind of like really big challenge to a Western perspective that like you couldn't actually pinpoint everything solely as a a dot in space, time, and matter, that actually it can also continue as a wave. And we also know that there's some really weird paradoxes that come out of that, because if you allow particles to go through a double slit and you don't observe you aren't observing the process, the end result is the diffraction gradient that shows that the particles actually are interacting with one another in constructive and destructive interference. But if you do observe it, they collapse, so to speak, into two points that show that they're behaving like a particle. And so there's something really powerful going on there, where Indigenous worldviews, which are wave-based, have ways of being in the world that don't collapse things into the observed particle behavior, but actually can still somehow engage with that wave-like relationship. And that's where I get really excited about the constructive and destructive interference, because rather than collapsing ourselves into different hanks of a braid, like the particle on the right, the very right side there, that is being observed. It's being observed in workshops. It's being observed in courts. It's being observed by scientists who are like very earnestly recording Indigenous TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, so that they can put it into their documents that they're supplying to different federal agencies. Still, as Karen Brad would say, that's a mixture that is it's not giving us the full picture of what's actually going on, which is actually that in the universe, the way that things are interacting is through these interference patterns. And so I am starting to move away from those old paradigms that I was working with that felt liberatory, but as I saw the state continuing to mobilize violence against land and water defenders, I started to realize was still this very constrictive, very suffocating space that was folding through the white possession and through what Kira Long calls possessive ecologies, Indigenous worlds, into the nightmares of white possession. If we move away from that and refuse to be particles, and maybe that's what resurgence is, refusing to be collapsed to an infinitely small snapshot of space, time, and matter, but actually just insist on being disruptive forces through a field, then we can think about our constructive and destructive interference. And when our peaks and valleys align, we actually are in a superposition where we enhance one another. And those are the lines on the interference pattern that show up as bright lines if light is going through the double slit. And if our peaks and valleys don't line up, we cancel one another, and we are in destructive interference. And I think maybe that's a more helpful way to think about solidarity as we move forward through the incredible challenges ahead, where we are trapped in this sort of white, possessive white dominion that insists that it's the only legitimate way to govern the planet. So this also brings me to, this is where I'll close. So the solidarities between peoples that have been displaced and dispossessed by imperialism, white supremacy, colonial capitalism, extraction. The late Secwepemc thinker George Manuel from here in British Columbia coined the concept of the fourth world from a conversation he had with Mbutu Malando, who was the first secretary of the Tanzanian High Commission in Canada, in a conversation they had where Malando stated to George Manuel that, quote, when Native peoples come into their own on the basis of their own cultures and traditions, that will be the fourth world. And so this concept continues to animate me. And so I just want to close with, we've always been scientists. And earlier this year, my late stepfather was incredibly humble. He dropped out of his PhD. He dealt with incredible bullying and harassment by the white settler scientists that he continued to engage with because he was a curator at the Museum of Zoology at the University of Alberta, but they were incredibly dismissive of the kind of research he did. And I'm pretty certain some of them appropriated his work without credit, just from reading through some of the things that came out of the literature later on. And definitely he hasn't been given his due in terms of the incredible contribution he made to Alberta fish science and species at risk science. I've made it my mission to make sure that his work is acknowledged, precisely because he was an Indigenous scientist at a time when that was not welcome in the academy. People were not getting grants by adding Indigenous scientists onto their applications to the federal funding bodies. In fact, that was probably at best, an indifferent addition. And so Wayne, being the humble person that he was, never told us that actually when he worked with some of his colleagues, including his mentor, Joe Nelson, who was a world famous ichthyologist who spent his career sort of systematically classifying different orders and genus and species of fish. They were some of the first Western practicing scientists to notice a specific species of mooneye in Alberta. And those species were actually just quietly sent to the American Museum of Natural History. And I had no idea about this until I was invited to apply for a fellowship, which I didn't get, which is fine. The gift of that invitation was I started to think through if I went to New York, what would I do? I would look for collections of Alberta fish if they're held anywhere in any institutions in New York and Washington, D.C. And in doing so, found 3 specimens that Wayne collected in the 70s that are in that museum. And so I've made it my mission to eventually update my passport and make my way to New York, just so that I can visit these fish that my relative collected that he never told us about, and are a tangible connection back to him. So I know that you've been through a lot as a country and as a collective, and I know there's a lot of probably a lot of grief and things that are going to be hard in the coming days, months, years. But just know that we are connected across the waters that refuse the borders of the US and Canada. And this wave thinking also for me is a way to think beyond the violences inherent in how the states of the US and Canada have been imposed on peoples, both human and more than human here. And so this is where I guess I'll close with Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been an incredible inspiration to me in terms of how his thinking resonates so deeply with so many Indigenous perspectives on existence here in Canada. And Vine Deloria, as I understand, had been thinking across Eastern philosophies and Indigenous philosophies and had always planned to kind of deepen that thinking, but it was one of the projects he never got a chance to complete, according to the afterword of his Metaphysics of Modern Existence by David Wallace. So these are just sort of 3 quotes about waves that I'm holding with me today. The first is, a wave has a right to live her life as a wave, but she must also learn to live her life as water, because she is not only a wave, she is also water, and water lives without the fear carried by the wave. And so I think of that also as I refuse the wave of populism that is trying to strangle life across the planet. And I know I can't do that alone. Um, the second one that I found this morning was enlightenment is when a wave realizes it's the ocean. And I like this version of enlightenment a lot more than Newton and Leibniz and Descartes, especially because Newton and Descartes, by all accounts, were kind of jerks, very ego driven. And then the final thought is, what is the home of a wave? The home of the wave is all the other waves. And the home of the wave is water. And if the wave is capable of touching himself and the other waves very deeply, he will realize that he is made of water. Being aware that he is water, he transcends all discrimination, sorrows, and fears. Your home is available in the here and the now. And so I know that that's not immediately possible to enact for every specific community that's being violated by imperialism and states right now. But that's the version of reality I want to bring into existence however I can, by every little fishy story I tell and every gathering that is so kind enough to invite me in to talk about these thoughts that have been rattling around my head for a long time. So, Ginana Skolmiten, thank you.